Kang Wu walked slowly across the massive floor of the Galactic Assembly Hall, and every step he took made more noise than he wanted it to make because the entire place had gone quiet in a way that felt wrong and uncomfortable, like when you walk into a room and know people were talking about you just seconds before you arrived, and now they are all staring at you with faces that say they do not like you very much at all, which was exactly what was happening to him right now as he moved toward the speaking platform in the center of this enormous circular room that could hold 10,000 beings from different worlds. And today it was completely full of aliens who had come here just to watch humans get embarrassed in front of everyone. The silence did not last long because as soon as Kang Wu reached the platform and turned around to face the crowd, someone in the back started laughing, and then someone else joined in. And within seconds, the whole place was filled with the sounds of dozens of different species all laughing at once, which created this weird mixture of sounds like growls and clicks and musical notes and buzzing and roaring that somehow all combined together to clearly say that every single being in this room thought humans were the biggest joke in the galaxy, and they were not even trying to hide it anymore. Yoon Hana sat in the human observation section and watched this happen and felt her stomach twist into knots because she had known this was going to be bad, but she had not expected it to be quite this bad, and she could see other humans in their section looking down at their hands or at the floor or anywhere except at Kang Wu, who was standing perfectly still on the platform, waiting for the laughter to die down, which it showed no signs of doing any time soon, because every time it started to get quieter, someone would make a joke and set everyone off again. The Vorthak Empire had sent their best general to this meeting, and his name was Thexmore, and he was huge, even by Vorthak standards, which meant he was about 3 times bigger than any human, and had 4 arms that ended in claws and skin that looked like it was made of metal scales. And when he stood up from his seat, the laughter got even louder because everyone knew he was about to say something that would make the humans look even worse than they already did. Thexmore raised all 4 of his arms, and the laughter slowly died down because when a Vorthak general wants to speak, everyone else shuts up, or they might end up getting torn apart by those claws. And he looked down at Kang Wu like he was looking at something small and pathetic that he had found stuck to the bottom of his boot. Look at this tiny creature standing before us and trying to speak about war and peace, as if it knows anything about either one, Thexmore said, and his voice was so deep it made the floor vibrate under everyone's feet. The humans come here with their little ships and their soft skin and their weak bodies, and they want us to listen to them talk about how we should all be friends and stop fighting each other when they have never won a single battle against any species stronger than themselves. The crowd loved this and started laughing again and making comments to each other about how pathetic humans were and how they should go back to their little planet and hide there until the real species decided what to do with the galaxy, and Kang Wu just stood there and took it all without moving or changing the expression on his face, which was calm and patient, like he was waiting for something that only he knew was coming. Zithara from the crystalline hegemony floated up from her section. Because her species did not walk, they just moved through the air like they were swimming through invisible water, and when she spoke, her voice sounded like someone playing a beautiful song on an instrument made of glass, which would have been pleasant to listen to if she had not been using that lovely voice to say terrible things about humans. Perhaps we should ask the humans to tell us about all the great battles they have won, she said, and her voice made musical notes that somehow sounded like laughing. Or maybe they can share stories about all the worlds they have conquered with their mighty fleet of 12 ships that run away whenever they see anything bigger than a space rock. More laughter filled the hall, and now beings were standing up and shouting their own jokes about humans and their weakness and their cowardice and their complete inability to fight anyone or anything. And Yoon Hana felt like she wanted to sink through the floor and disappear because this was supposed to be a serious diplomatic meeting where they discussed the wars happening in the Outer Rim territories, but instead, it had turned into a giant party where everyone made fun of her species. Lee Dong-soo, who was sitting next to Yoon Hana, leaned over and whispered, "Should we do something to help him?" And she shook her head because she knew that Kang Wu had volunteered for this exact situation, and he had spent months preparing for this moment when every species in the galaxy would laugh at humans and mock them for being weak and peaceful, and she trusted him to handle it the way they had all agreed he should handle it. A being from the Razor Claw Collective stood up and started making cutting motions with its arms while talking about how humans were so soft that they would probably cry if anyone even looked at them wrong, and this got the biggest laugh yet, because everyone thought the idea of a human crying was the funniest thing they had ever heard, and they all started making crying sounds in their own languages, which created this horrible chorus of mocking that filled the entire hall. Kang Wu waded through all of this, and when a piece of fruit came flying through the air and hit the platform near his feet, he did not even look down at it. He just kept watching the crowd with those dark eyes that seemed to be memorizing every face and every insult and every laugh as if he was storing them all away for later use. Finally, after what felt like hours, but was probably only 10 minutes, the laughter started to die down, because even the cruelest beings in the galaxy eventually get tired of making the same jokes over and over again, and when the hall was quiet enough that everyone could hear normal, talking voices again, Kang Wu took one step forward and spoke for the first time since he had walked onto that platform. "We understand your amusement," he said, and his voice was not loud, but somehow everyone in that huge room could hear every word, perfectly clearly. "You find it funny that humans avoid war, and you think this makes us weak and cowardly and unfit to have any say in how this galaxy is run." He paused and looked around the room, making eye contact with as many beings as possible, and there was something in his face that made a few of them stop smiling, because they suddenly realized that maybe this human was not quite as simple and harmless as they had thought he was. But before you make your final decision about what humans are and what we are capable of, and whether we deserve to be part of this galactic community, Kang Wu continued, "Perhaps you should know the real reason why we avoid war." The laughter started to come back, but it was not as strong as before because something in the way Kang Wu was standing and speaking made some of the smarter beings in the audience start to wonder if maybe they were missing something important about humans, and maybe this was not going to end the way they thought it was. "Going to end. You mock us for having small fleets, and you laugh at us for choosing diplomacy over conquest, and you think this proves that we are weak," Kang Wu said, "but you have never asked yourselves a very important question." He let the silence stretch out until everyone was waiting to hear what he was going to say next, and even the beings who were still laughing had gotten quiet, because they wanted to know what this pathetic human thought was so important that it would change anyone's mind about anything. "The question you should be asking," Kang Wu said, "is not why humans are bad at war, but why a species that has mastered faster than light travel and energy weapons and artificial intelligence chooses to build so few warships and conquer so few worlds." For the first time since the meeting began, the hall was completely silent, and you could have heard a pin drop, because suddenly everyone was thinking about that question and realizing that maybe they had been looking at this whole situation wrong, and maybe there was more to humans than they had bothered to find out. Li Jun walked across the platform to stand next to Kang Wu, and he looked much older than the ambassador, with gray hair and lines on his face that came from spending 60 years studying the worst parts of human history, and when he activated the holographic display system above their heads, the entire hall filled with a soft blue light that made everyone look up to see what the humans were going to show them next. The first image that appeared was a picture of Earth taken from space, and it showed a beautiful blue and green world with white clouds swirling around it, and continents that looked peaceful and safe, and cities that glowed with gentle light, and everyone in the audience had seen this image before, because it was the one humans always used when they wanted to show other species how nice their home planet was. "You mock us for having small fleets and avoiding war," Li Jun said, and his voice was steady and calm like a teacher talking to students who did not understand their lesson yet, but you have never asked why a species that has learned to travel between stars chooses to build so few weapons of war. The image changed to show human cities from above, and they looked clean and organized with parks and rivers and buildings that seemed to grow out of the landscape instead of being forced onto it, and beings throughout the hall made small sounds of appreciation, because even the most warlike species could recognize beauty when they saw it, and these cities were undeniably beautiful. Park Mira sat in the human section and watched the alien delegates looking at these images with expressions that were starting to change from mockery to confusion, because they were beginning to realize that the humans might be about to show them something they had not expected, and she felt her heart beating faster because she knew what was coming next. "These images show our cities as they exist today," Li Jun continued. But now I want to show you images of human cities from our year 1945. The display changed, and suddenly the hall was filled with pictures that made several aliens gasp in shock, and others lean back in their seats as if they were trying to get away from what they were seeing. Because instead of beautiful cities with parks and rivers, there were images of complete destruction, with buildings reduced to rubble and roads that had been turned into craters and skies that were dark with smoke and ash. This is what our cities looked like after we learned to split the atom, Li Jun said, and our first instinct when we discovered how to break apart the basic building blocks of matter was to turn that knowledge into a weapon that could destroy entire cities in seconds. The images kept changing to show more devastation. And now there were pictures of people walking through ruins and children sitting alone in the remains of what had once been their homes, and beings throughout the hall were starting to make uncomfortable sounds because they had never seen destruction quite like this before. Because most species, when they fought wars, did it with energy weapons or projectiles that killed cleanly, but these images showed something much worse. 2 cities were destroyed in a matter of seconds, Li Jun continued, and more than 200,000 humans died in the time it takes you to blink your eyes twice. Choi Hyun stood at attention in his military dress uniform, and his face showed no emotion, but his hands were clenched into fists, because he had grown up hearing stories about those 2 cities from his grandfather, who had been there and had seen the flash of light that turned people into shadows, burned into walls, and had spent the rest of his life trying to forget what human weapons could do to human bodies. The display changed again to show more images of war and destruction, and now there were pictures of battles fought with conventional weapons that went on for years and killed millions of people over distances that could be measured in meters, and the alien delegates were starting to understand that these humans who seemed so peaceful and weak had actually spent most of their history finding new and better ways to kill each other. We fought wars with sticks and stones and bronze and iron and gunpowder and poison gas, Li Jun said, and every time we invented something new, our first thought was always how to use it to kill our enemies more efficiently. Zithara from the crystalline hegemony stopped floating and settled into her seat because her species had never developed weapons more advanced than energy beams that killed quickly and cleanly, and they had certainly never created anything that could destroy entire cities full of innocent people in seconds, and she was starting to realize that maybe humans were not weak. Maybe they were something much more dangerous. The images now showed trenches full of soldiers who lived in mud and fought battles that moved the front lines only a few meters at a time but cost hundreds of thousands of lives, and there were pictures of poison gas rolling across battlefields like fog. Except this fog killed everything it touched, and there were images of machines, designed only for killing, that could cut down hundreds of men in minutes. Nam Soo-jin felt tears running down her cheeks as she watched these images, because she had studied human history in school, but seeing it presented like this to beings who had never experienced anything like it made her understand for the first time just how terrible her species had been to itself, and she wondered if the other humans in the audience were feeling the same way. We fought a war that lasted 4 years and killed 17 million people, Li Jun said, and then 20 years later we fought another war that killed 3% of our entire planetary population. The display showed images from that second war, and these were even worse, because by then humans had gotten much better at killing each other and had learned to use industrial methods to murder millions of people as efficiently as possible, and there were pictures of factories that had been built for no other purpose than to kill human beings and process their bodies like they were manufacturing products instead of ending lives. Thexmore, the Vorthak general, leaned forward in his seat, because his species was known throughout the galaxy for being fierce warriors who loved battle and had conquered dozens of worlds, but even they had never done anything like what these images were showing, and he was beginning to understand that when humans talked about avoiding war, they were not talking about the same thing that other species meant when they used that word. We created weapons that could end all life on our planet, Li Jun continued. And we built thousands of them and pointed them at each other for decades, waiting to see who would be the first to use them. The images now showed missiles and bombs that were thousands of times more powerful than the weapons that had destroyed those first 2 cities, and there were pictures of underground bunkers and early warning systems and maps showing how many times over The humans could have destroyed their entire world if they had ever decided to use all these weapons at once. Kim Tae-hyung stood up in the human section, and his voice carried across the hall even though he was not using a microphone. Because the acoustics in this place were designed to let everyone hear what was being said, no matter where they were sitting. The worst part was not the wars themselves, he said. It was how good we became at fighting them. The display changed to show more recent human military technology, and now there were weapons that could level mountains and viruses designed to target specific genetic markers and artificial intelligences that had been created for no other purpose than to find better ways to kill the enemy, and some of the alien delegates started making sounds of distress because they were realizing that the small, peaceful fleets that humans maintained were not a sign of weakness, but a sign of incredible restraint. We did not just fight wars. Kim Tae-hyung continued. We studied them and analyzed them and turned them into a science that we perfected over thousands of years. Lee Jun activated another series of images that showed human military academies and war colleges, and libraries full of books about strategy and tactics, and the history of every battle that had ever been fought on Earth, and there were pictures of generals studying maps, and soldiers training for combat, and weapons designers working on new ways to kill more people more efficiently. Every human child learns about these wars in school, Lee Jun said, not because we are proud of them, but because we want to make sure that everyone understands what happens when humans decide that violence is the answer to their problems. The hall was completely silent now, except for the sound of beings shifting uncomfortably in their seats, because they were starting to understand that they had been looking at humans completely wrong, and that maybe the reason humans avoided war was not because they were weak, but because they knew exactly what war really meant and what it really cost. The holographic display shifted again, and now it was showing a timeline that stretched across the entire ceiling of the assembly hall, and every mark on that timeline represented another human war, and there were so many marks that they looked like stars scattered across the night sky, except each one of these stars represented thousands or millions of deaths, and Lee Jun stood beneath this display like a man standing under the weight of his entire species' history. We have been fighting wars for 10,000 years, Lee Jun said, and his voice never wavered, even though he was talking about the most horrible things his species had ever done. And in all that time, we never stopped finding new ways to kill each other more efficiently. Tatias. Display zoomed in on different parts of the timeline and showed specific wars and battles, and each one was worse than the last, because humans kept learning and adapting and getting better at the art of killing. And there were images of siege weapons that could knock down city walls and cavalry charges that could break entire armies, and naval battles where ships full of men sank to the bottom of the ocean with all hands lost. Nam Soo-jin wiped tears from her eyes as she watched images of children being taught to make weapons, and women working in factories that produced nothing but instruments of death, and old men sitting around tables planning how to kill as many enemy soldiers as possible with the fewest resources. And she realized that war had not just been something humans did, it had been something that shaped every part of their civilization for thousands of years. We fought with swords and spears and bows and arrows, Lee Jun continued, and then we invented gunpowder, and suddenly, we could kill people from much farther away and much more quickly. The images showed battles where men stood in lines and fired muskets at each other across open fields, and cannons that could punch holes through castle walls and naval. Battles where ships destroyed each other with broadsides that turned wooden vessels into floating funeral pyres, and the alien delegates were starting to understand that human warfare was not just about winning battles, it was about finding the most effective ways to cause death and destruction. Thexmore, the Vorthak general, felt something he had never experienced before, which was a kind of cold fear in his stomach, because his species had always prided themselves on being the greatest warriors in the galaxy. But looking at these images, he was beginning to realize that humans had been perfecting the art of war for longer than most species had even existed, and they had gotten very, very good at it. We learned to use chemistry to create poison gas that would kill everything in its path, Lee Jun said, and we used it against soldiers who had no protection and watched them die in agony while we sat safely in our trenches. The display showed images of battlefields covered in yellow clouds of gas that killed everything they touched, and soldiers wearing masks that made them look like monsters, and bodies lying in shell craters filled with poisoned water, and several alien delegates made sounds of revulsion, because their species had never developed chemical weapons and they found the idea of using poison to kill enemies deeply disturbing. We learned to build machines that could kill hundreds of people in minutes, Li Jun continued, and we used them to mow down entire armies like farmers cutting grain. Now there were images of machine guns firing into crowds of charging soldiers and artillery barrages that could be heard from 100 kilometers away, and tanks rolling across battlefields crushing everything in their path, and bomber aircraft dropping explosives on cities full of civilians who had nothing to do with the war, except that they happened to live in the wrong place, Zithara. From the crystalline hegemony began emitting a low frequency sound that her species made when they were deeply disturbed, because she was looking at images of human beings doing things to other human beings that her species had never even imagined, and she was starting to understand that maybe the reason humans were so good at diplomacy was that they knew exactly what the alternative looked like. We fought a war that killed 60 million people, Li Jun said, and we used factories and railroads and industrial methods to kill them as efficiently as possible. The display showed images that made several alien delegates cover their eyes or turn away, because they showed human beings being processed like products in factories designed specifically for murder. And there were pictures of railroad cars full of people being transported to places where they would be killed in ways that were designed to be as efficient as possible, and maps showing how these killing factories were distributed across entire continents. Kim Tae-hyung stood up again, and his voice was steady, but everyone could see that his hands were shaking because he was talking about the worst things his species had ever done, and he had spent his entire career studying these events so that humans would never forget what they were capable of when they stopped caring about right and wrong. We did not just kill enemy soldiers, he said. We developed methods for killing entire populations of civilians, including children and old people and anyone else who belonged to groups we decided we did not like. The images showed the systematic murder of millions of people who had never been soldiers and had never fought in any war, but had been killed simply because of their race or religion or political beliefs, and the alien delegates were starting to make sounds of horror because most species in the galaxy had never developed this kind of systematic approach to genocide. We built gas chambers disguised as shower rooms, Kim Tae-hyung continued, and we told people they were going to get cleaned up, but instead we pumped poison gas in and killed them by the thousands every single day. Several beings in the audience stood up and started walking toward the exits because they could not stand to hear any more about what humans had done to each other, but security guards blocked the doors because this session had been declared mandatory for all species representatives, and they were required to listen to everything the humans had to say. Li Jun activated another series of images that showed the liberation of these death camps by human soldiers who found piles of bodies stacked like cordwood, and survivors who were so thin they looked like skeletons, and mass graves that contained thousands of victims. And even the human soldiers in these pictures looked shocked and horrified by what their own species had been capable of doing. And then we invented nuclear weapons, Li Jun said, and we used them on cities full of civilians because we wanted to end the war quickly. The display showed the mushroom clouds rising over those two Japanese cities, and then images of the aftermath with shadows burned into walls where people had been standing when the bombs exploded, and hospitals full of people whose skin was falling off their bodies, and children born years later with deformities caused by radiation, and the alien delegates were starting to understand that humans had not just fought wars. They had fought wars in ways that other species had never even considered. But that was just the beginning. Li Jun continued, because then we built thousands more nuclear weapons, each one more powerful than the last, and we pointed them at each other for 50 years. The images showed missile silos and nuclear submarines and bombers carrying weapons that could destroy entire cities, and maps showing how the humans had divided their planet into two armed camps, each one ready to destroy the other at a moment's notice, and charts showing how many times over they could have killed every living thing on their world if they had ever decided to use all these weapons. Choi Hyun stepped forward, and his military uniform looked different now because the aliens were starting to realize that it represented a species that had spent thousands of years learning how to kill more efficiently than anyone else in the galaxy. and when he spoke his voice carried the authority of someone who had studied every aspect of human warfare. "We did not just build these weapons and store them away," he said. "We created entire military doctrines based on the idea that we might need to destroy our entire civilization in order to prevent the other side from winning." The display showed war plans that involved launching thousands of nuclear missiles simultaneously and calculations about how many cities could be destroyed before the enemy could respond, and estimates of how many millions of people would die in the first few hours of such a war, and several alien delegates were now making sounds that indicated they were going to be physically sick. "We trained our soldiers to fight in the radioactive ruins that would be left after such a war," Choi Hyun continued, "and we built underground bunkers where our leaders could survive while everyone else died." The images showed soldiers wearing protective suits designed for fighting in radioactive wastelands and government bunkers stocked with supplies for surviving. Nuclear winter and maps showing which cities would be targeted first and how long it would take for the radiation to kill everyone in the surrounding areas. Kang Wu returned to the center of the platform, and the holographic display changed to show images of Earth as it looked today, with clean cities and green forests, and children playing in parks where no bombs had fallen for decades. And the contrast between these peaceful scenes and the images of war that had filled the hall just minutes before was so stark that several alien delegates sat in stunned silence, trying to process what they were seeing. "You wonder why we have small fleets," Kang Wu said, and his voice was quiet, but it carried to every corner of the enormous hall. "And you think our preference for diplomacy makes us weak and cowardly, but you have never asked yourselves the most important question of all." He paused and looked around the room, making eye contact with beings from dozens of different species, and there was something in his expression that made them all pay attention because they were starting to realize that this human standing before them was not the simple, peaceful creature they had thought he was. "The question you should be asking is not whether humans are capable of fighting wars," Kang Wu continued, "but why a species that has gotten so good at warfare chooses not to use those skills." "Oh." Min-jae stepped forward from the human delegation section and activated a new holographic display that showed technical specifications and manufacturing capabilities and industrial output figures that made several alien military advisors lean forward in their seats because they were finally seeing numbers that told a very different story about human military capacity. "Our current defense fleet represents approximately 0.3% of our actual military production capability." "Oh," Min-jae said, and his voice was matter-of-fact, like he was reading a grocery list, instead of revealing information that was making several species representatives recalculate everything they thought they knew about human military strength. The display showed shipyard capacity and resource allocation charts and theoretical production timelines that indicated humans could build warships at a rate that would dwarf the combined fleets of most other species, and there were manufacturing specifications for weapons systems that were decades ahead of anything else in the galaxy. Zith-Ara, from the crystalline hegemony, began emitting harmonic frequencies that indicated extreme distress because her species had based their entire military strategy on the assumption that humans were technologically inferior, and now she was looking at evidence that suggested humans had been deliberately hiding their true capabilities for reasons she was only beginning to understand. "What do you mean by actual capability?" she asked, and her musical voice had lost all of its earlier mockery and now carried a note of fear that made other delegates turn to look at her. Bae Sumin stood up from her seat in the human section, and when she moved, everyone could see the cybernetic arm that she wore where her natural arm had been lost in humanity's last internal conflict, and there were scars on her face that told their own story about the price of human warfare, and when she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone who had commanded fleets in battles that other species had never even heard about. "We avoid war because we are very, very good at it," she said simply, and those words hung in the air like smoke from a battlefield, because they contained a truth that was both terrifying and undeniable. The holographic display changed to show industrial capacity numbers that made it clear that humans could produce military equipment at rates that would allow them to outfit armies larger than most species had ever imagined, and there were resource extraction capabilities and logistics networks that could support military operations on a scale that dwarfed anything else in the galaxy. Our entire species carries the genetic and cultural memory of 10,000 years of increasingly sophisticated violence. Bei Suman continued. And every human child learns about our wars not because we are proud of them, but because we want to make sure they understand why we chose to stop fighting. The display showed educational materials from human schools and military academies and research institutions where the art of warfare was studied with the same intensity that other species devoted to medicine or engineering, and there were libraries full of tactical manuals and strategic analyses and historical studies that represented the accumulated knowledge of millennia spent perfecting the science of conflict. Vexmore the Vorthak general felt something that his species had no word for because they had never experienced the realization that another species was not just stronger than them, but had been deliberately restraining itself from demonstrating that strength. And he was beginning to understand that every interaction his people had ever had with humans had been shaped by human choice rather than human weakness. In our ancient languages, we have over 300 words for different types of warfare, Bei Suman said, and we have tactical manuals that span millennia. And we have generals who study conflicts that happened before most of your species achieved spaceflight. The images showed human military historians analyzing battles that had been fought thousands of years ago and extracting lessons that could be applied to modern warfare, and there were war colleges where human officers studied every possible aspect of conflict from logistics and supply lines to psychological warfare and strategic deception. We know how to fight wars. In space and on planets and in underground tunnels and in the depths of oceans, she continued. And we know how to fight wars with conventional weapons and nuclear weapons and biological weapons and weapons that have not been invented yet. The display showed research facilities where humans developed weapons systems that were decades ahead of anything used by other species, and there were testing grounds where these weapons were evaluated and improved, and storage facilities where they were kept ready for use if they were ever needed. Yang Jiwoo stood up from her seat and walked to the edge of the human section so that everyone could see the scars that covered half of her face, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone who had survived humanity's transition from a warlike species to a peaceful one and had paid a personal price for that transformation. We do not avoid war because we are weak, she said, and every word was clear and precise. We avoid war because we know exactly what it costs, and more importantly, we know exactly what we become when we wage it. The holographic display changed to show archived footage of human soldiers in combat, and these were not the fumbling primitives that other species had imagined, but efficient, relentless, terrifyingly effective warriors who moved with precision and fought with a level of coordination that came from thousands of years of military evolution. You see our small fleets and think us cowards, Lee Seojin called out from the back of the human section. But every ship we do not build, and every weapon we do not deploy, and every war we do not fight represents a choice we make every single day. The images showed human shipyards that could be converted to military production within weeks and factories that currently made civilian goods but could be retooled to produce weapons, and millions of human civilians who had received military training and could be mobilized if their planet was ever threatened. That choice is not weakness, Lee Seojin continued. That choice is restraint. And restraint is the most difficult thing for humans to maintain, because our instincts and our history and our culture all tell us to respond to threats with overwhelming force. Yun Hana watched from the observation section as the mood in the hall changed from mockery to confusion to understanding to something approaching fear, because the alien delegates were finally grasping the implications of what they were hearing, and she could see in their faces the moment when they realized that humans had not been excluded from galactic power structures because they were weak, but because other species had been unconsciously protecting themselves from something they sensed but did not understand. The chamber remained silent as Kang Wu prepared for his final statement, and behind him, Dr. Ryu Hanul activated one last holographic display that filled the entire ceiling with names written in dozens of different human languages, and there were so many names that they looked like snowflakes falling from the sky, except each one represented a human being who had died learning why war should be the last resort instead of the first choice. These are the humans who died teaching us why we should choose peace over conflict, Kang Wu said, and his voice carried a weight that seemed to press down on every being in the chamber. Every name you see represents a lesson that was purchased with blood and suffering and loss, the names kept, scrolling past overhead, and they went on and on and on, because there were billions of them representing every human who had ever died in war, from the first caveman, who was killed by a rival tribe, to the last soldier who died in humanity's final. Internal conflict and the sheer number of dead was staggering, even to species that had fought their own wars. Yang Jiwoo stepped forward, and the scars on her face caught the light from the holographic display as she moved, and when she spoke, every being in the hall could hear the pain in her voice that came from having lived through the worst of human nature and emerged on the other side with a deeper understanding of what peace really meant. "We do not avoid war because we are weak," she said, and each word was chosen carefully. "We avoid war because we know exactly what it costs, not just in terms of lives lost, but in terms of what we become when we decide that violence is the answer to our problems." The display changed to show archived footage of human soldiers in action, and these images were different from the historical battles they had shown earlier, because these soldiers moved with a precision and efficiency that came from thousands of years of military evolution. And they fought with weapons that could level mountains and destroy cities and end entire civilizations. "You see our small fleets and think us cowards," Lee Seojin said from his position at the back of the chamber. "But every ship we do not build, and every weapon we do not manufacture, and every war we do not fight represents a conscious choice that we make every single day." The holographic display shifted to show human industrial capacity and manufacturing capabilities and resource allocation, systems that could be converted to military production within weeks, and there were civilian factories that could be retooled to produce weapons, and millions of human citizens who had received military training and could be mobilized if their home world was ever threatened. "That choice is not weakness," Lee Seojin continued. "That choice is restraint, and restraint is the hardest thing for humans to maintain because everything in our biology and our psychology and our cultural history tells us to respond to threats with overwhelming force." Kang Wu looked directly at Thexamore the Vorthak general, who had started this meeting by mocking human weakness, and now sat in stunned silence trying to process the implications of everything he had heard. And when Kang Wu spoke, his words were directed at the general, but they were meant for every being in the chamber. "You asked why we do not take worlds by force and conquer our neighbors and build the kind of empire that would make other species fear us," Kang Wu said, and the answer is simple, but not easy to understand. The display showed images of human colonies that had been established through trade agreements and diplomatic negotiations instead of military conquest. And there were pictures of human scientists and engineers working alongside alien researchers to solve problems that affected multiple species, and examples of human aid missions to worlds that had been devastated by natural disasters. It is because we learned that when humans go to war, we do not just fight to win battles or capture territory or defeat our enemies. Kang Wu continued. We fight to end the fight permanently, which means we fight to eliminate any possibility that we will have to fight that particular enemy ever again. The silence in the chamber was complete and absolute, because every being there was starting to understand what that statement really meant, and they were realizing that human restraint was not a sign of weakness, but a form of mercy that other species had never even recognized. We learned this lesson by fighting ourselves for 10,000 years, Kang Wu said, and we learned it so well that we nearly destroyed our entire civilization before we finally understood what we were doing. Park Dong-yun stood up in the human delegation section, and his voice carried the authority of someone who had spent decades negotiating with alien species and helping them understand human motivations and capabilities. We are saying that humanity's greatest strength is not our capacity for war, he said, but our choice to use that capacity only when every other option has been exhausted. The holographic display changed one final time to show a simple image of Earth floating peacefully in space, surrounded by the small fleet of ships that humans maintained for defense and exploration, and the contrast between this peaceful scene and everything they had just learned about human military capabilities was so stark that it left the alien delegates struggling to reconcile what they were seeing with what they now knew. "We do not avoid war because we cannot fight," Kang Wu said, and these words would be remembered and quoted throughout the galaxy for generations to come. "We avoid war because we are the only species that truly learned what fighting really means and what it really costs." He paused and looked around the chamber one last time, making eye contact with representatives from every species present. And when he spoke again, his voice carried a finality that indicated he was done explaining. And now it was time for the galaxy to decide what it wanted to do with this information. "We offer you our friendship and our cooperation, and our help in solving the problems that face all of our species," he said. "But we also offer you this warning which you can choose to heed or ignore as you see fit." The chamber remained silent, as beings throughout the hall waited to hear what the human ambassador was going to say next, and many of them were already beginning to realize that the balance of power in the galaxy had just shifted in ways they were only starting to understand. "If you choose to force us into a war that we do not want to fight," Kang Wu said, "you will discover that our restraint was the only thing protecting you from learning what 10,000 years of military evolution can produce when it is unleashed without limits." Zithara, from the crystalline hegemony, floated up from her seat, and her musical voice was subdued and worried as she asked the question that every being in the chamber was thinking, but none of them had dared to voice. "What are you telling us?" she asked. The holographic display went dark, and Kang Wu stood alone on the platform, surrounded by representatives from 47 different worlds, all of whom were looking at him with expressions that ranged from fear to respect to something approaching awe. "We are telling you that we choose peace not because we must, but because we can," he said. "And we are hoping that you will make the same choice, not because you fear us, but because you understand that cooperation serves everyone better than conflict." The vote on humanity's mediation proposal was unanimous, and no one in the Galactic Assembly ever laughed at human peacekeepers again, because they finally understood that human peace was not a sign of weakness, but a gift that the galaxy had been receiving without even knowing it. And they realized that this gift could be withdrawn if they ever forced humans to remember what they used to be, before they chose to become what they were now.